Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. A very quick update today in the middle of testing, just to pick up on a couple of things that were spotted or that were highlighted on day one. We're going to start, of course, it was a difficult day, wasn't it, with all the wind and the sand, and the reason the wind is so disruptive to an F1 car is because it's so aerodynamically sensitive. On day one of pre-season testing, one of the biggest things you're trying to understand is how the aerodynamics of your car work, how stable it is going into corners, how the driver feels, but also what the data you're gathering and how that, we hear the word correlation so much, how it correlates to the data you've been collecting previously from your wind tunnel and your CFD in the virtual world. Day one is all about rigging the car up with rakes and sensors to correlate that data, to make sure that data matches up, because if it does, you know that you can go through the season developing in the virtual world and be confident that when it translates to the real car on a real racetrack, you'll get the same kind of results. You'll get the same feeling or the same performance that you were getting in the virtual world. If on day one you start to get mismatched results, or the feeling and the data you're collecting doesn't match up to what you've been basing development on in the wind tunnel and the CFD, you're in a world of pain because you no longer have trust in those systems, and therefore with a lack of actual real world testing, you're going to find it very difficult to develop your car as the season goes on. These things, these enormous rakes, I thought I'd point those out. You see lots of cars using them over the course of this test. Only 3 days, of course, this year. But these things are a work of art, and a huge amount of effort and work goes into those. They have to be designed in-house by the F1 team, by the same people that design the cars. They've got to be manufactured in-house too. A huge amount of effort and time and development has to go into just this piece to be able to collect that data. It's rigged, of course, with air pressure sensors that are picking up the differences in air pressure and air speed around the various sensitive areas of the car. Now this one, you'll see a lot of work going on here because so many of the regulation changes around the floor, the diffuser, the rear brake ducts have affected this area. It's one of the biggest areas of development you'll see across all teams in the early part of the season, trying to work out how they can best manage the flow through this section and out through the back of here, maximising the performance of the diffuser, something that's been deliberately hampered with the changes of the cutout on the floor to be able to peg the cars back and intending to slow them down. The teams, of course, want to fight that regulation, they want to claw back the lost performance, and this is all part of that process. Another thing I wanted to point out, you may have seen it on the TV, Ferrari using these little lights on the rear end of the car. That's on day 2, I think. We may have seen it on day 1 as well. Those lights are essentially the team running, for similar reasons, like I just pointed out with that rake, in this sensitive area. The team will be running cameras mounted on the floor or mounted on the upright, looking down at things like tyre deflection, things like the gap between the tyre and the edge of the floor, which is constantly changing as the tyre squashes and deforms, of course, as it goes around corners. That information is absolutely key to understanding how we manage the flow through that gap. And how we manage the flow through that gap can be critical to how we manage to seal off the diffuser. And when I talk about sealing off the diffuser, I'm talking about maximising the flow coming through the underside of the car, being drawn out and expanded through that big expansion gap, which is the diffuser. That's how you generate the low pressure zone under the car, pulling the car down and sucking it down to the racetrack. If that flow, that low pressure zone under the car, is interrupted by tyre squirt or airflow being squirted out from the sides of the tyre at the contact patch, disappearing underneath the car and getting drawn into the diffuser, it really does hamper that overall performance. So understanding this area with the new regulations is crucial, and these lights are just another way of doing that. Mounting cameras on the car somewhere, they've got to be illuminated so you can see the images clearly enough, and that's exactly what that's doing. Now, the other thing with the Ferrari that I wanted to point out, because lots of people asked me about it, was the nose cone. Ferrari spent their tokens, their 2 development tokens at the rear of the car, so how on earth could they have a brand new nose as well? The point is that the development tokens are only needed to be used on what are classed homologated items. Things like the chassis, the monocoque, the nose cone, the rear impact structures or side impact structures. Those are homologated items, and there are others as well. But the homologated part of the nose is actually just the deformable crash structure, the bit that has to go through the FIA crash tests to be homologated for racing. The bit stuck on the front is actually just an aerodynamic shroud. So the actual crash structure ends around here, which means this piece, as with all teams, is just a bonded on structure for aerodynamic gain. So because the aerodynamic surfaces are all free, you don't need any token spend to develop those, they're free for the entire season. Aero development can just continue unrelented in that sense. So they can bond on a new structure, which is what they've done with these nicely curved, sculpted profiles on the edges here, designed to try and encourage the airflow to spill over the edge and get down into the cape area, the front of the floor, the barge boards, where it gets worked on towards the rear of the car. Lots of teams doing similar types of solution, just in different way. If you look at the bulbous front end of a Mercedes nose cone or the Aston Martin, for example, they're trying to do essentially exactly the same thing. They've just got a slightly different method of doing it. Now, the other big talking point that came out of day one was seeing the Alpine for the first time. A car that we didn't really see at the launch because all they did was re-livery their old car. But we got to see it yesterday, and perhaps the biggest talking point was this enormous section of bodywork behind the airbox that we haven't really seen on any other car. It bucks the trend where everyone else has been going for slimmer, narrower, more efficient, seemingly more efficient aerodynamic profiles. Now the actual air intake, that's part of the chassis, so that stays the same. That hasn't actually changed. It's behind that in the engine cover that's suddenly grown and become much more bulbous in its shape. And if we compare it to the last year's car, you get a very clear indication of what I'm talking about. So this section on the front, exactly the same, but behind it, much slimmer. Here, look, you can see how it's grown and expanded over the winter. Now, the Renault, as it was last year, was always slightly bigger than some of the other cars, but it's now absolutely got so much bigger than that. Now, the thinking behind this is because, as other teams have done, they've decided to move more of their cooling systems along the centre line of the car. Now that's not unusual. Other teams have already got radiators up there to be able to clear out stuff from the side pods to be able to slim those down. What Alpine have done is taken that to the extreme. We haven't seen underneath that yet, but you've got to assume they've put a lot more of their components from the cooling system, radiators, intercoolers, up into this section to allow them to have a much slimmer side pod. Now, at first I thought, it's not got this really extreme undercut that I would have assumed would be the benefit of compromising by moving everything else up to the centre line. But actually, when you compare the two cars, bearing in mind these are the same chassis from 2020 to 2021, you can easily see the distance between the edge of the side pod and the floor is much greater on the new car, giving them much more space down this side of the car to control the airflow into what's now an even more critical Coke bottle section of the car. Now, if you don't know what I'm talking about when I keep saying Coke bottle, if you look at an F1 car from the top down and you look at the bodywork profile, it tapers in over the gearbox to look like the neck of an old school Coke bottle. That's why people keep banging on about the Coke bottle section. But this year it's become really important to get that airflow in through this section between the rear tyres and the diffuser, which sits underneath the gearbox. For, like I said earlier on that Ferrari picture, it's about managing that flow and maximising what you can get from your diffuser, because the loss of the detail around the edge of the floor that we had last year, all these slots that were able to seal the edge of that floor and control the power of the diffuser, that's been lost. So now teams are having to look at new ways of doing it. Alpine's solution, although you get a cost in terms of moving centre of gravity up high, which is not what you want. The centre of mass moves higher up in the car. Now, on one hand, that's poor for chassis dynamics. But if they've realised or figured out that the compromise is not as big as it could be, and actually the benefit of maximising this area around here, getting more control and more flow around the side pod and into this area, if that offsets any loss from this higher centre of gravity and, of course, slightly larger frontal area from an aerodynamic perspective, then they may have stumbled onto something that others might well start to look at as time goes on. It's not something that most people are going to be able to copy, because this is an installation setup of the hardware components that are underneath that bodywork, but perhaps the way of thinking could be something that other people might consider to look at as we go further down the line in 2022 and beyond. If you look at the car from that angle, you can clearly see what I'm talking about. This huge gap between the edge of the floor and the edge of the side pod, allowing so much more flow to be controlled, first of all by the barge boards and by the front of the floor, but also by these elements on the side of the floor here, enabling the flow from the front of this leading edge of the floor to spill over and then be controlled into this huge gap, much more so than other teams might in theory be able to do. So interesting concept, different way of looking at the same problem that everyone's facing this year, but it's very rare that we get such a different solution. So it may not look dramatic, but in Formula One aerodynamics terms, this is quite a different way of looking at it. And finally, we got to see Mercedes' flaw, the piece that they quite openly said they were hiding at the team's launch. They didn't want anyone else to see because of the solutions that they had come up with to overcome the challenges of the new regulation changes, where we lost this big triangular section off the side of the floors from last year. And as I said, we also lost these longitudinal slots that ran all the way along the edge of those, designed to help protect the flow underneath the diffuser or underneath the car from being ingressed by a flow from outside. And the point about that is underneath the car, we've got a really low pressure, high speed airflow. Low pressure underneath the car means that the way it expands through the diffuser as we get high speed, low pressure zone under the car, the pressure around the car and above the car is higher, it's ambient, higher pressure than what's underneath. The higher pressure wants to push or pull down to the lower pressure zone, and that's what helps to create the downforce. It sucks the car down onto the racetrack, giving us grip. The problem with that is that if you've got a low pressure zone underneath the car there, and all of this area here is higher pressure and ambient, that higher pressure wants to rush in through this gap and interrupt that controlled flow underneath. We used to use these longitudinal slots running along the edge of the floor to help seal the gap between the car's floor and the racetrack with high-speed, powerful, energized vortices of airflow that formed an almost invisible wall, an invisible barrier to protect and stop the ingress of that high-pressure flow getting into the underside of the car. We can't do that anymore, so now teams are having to look at all sorts of different ways of doing it. The solution that Mercedes have come up with here is along the same lines as everyone else, but just a slightly different take on it, with 5 separate upturned curled sections at the leading edge of the floor here, designed to bring the flow at the front edge of this floor out. It will roll up and spill into the zone that we talked about on the Alpine, where we're kind of encouraging that flow to come over the top of here, get channeled into that Coke bottle area, rushing through here, pulling over the top of the diffuser and helping to draw flow through the underside. Down here though, a lot of this work is designed to try and protect that tyre squirt, that messy flow from the tyre as the tyre rotates and hits the contact patch with the road, the racetrack. The flow squirts out of either side, we call it tyre squirt, and a lot of that can rush in and again interrupt the flow at the diffuser. So a lot of this work is trying to form a barrier between the tyre and the diffuser by controlling flow through here, energizing it, directing it into a very specific zone to try and do that job. Everybody's working hard in this area. They will continue to work hard in this area, and I expect this to be an absolutely crucial area of development as the weeks and early months of the season go on. Bearing in mind, we're going to stop development on these cars at some stage. It's going to be a race to see who pulls the trigger first, who moves away from the 2021 cars and onto the 22 cars, and who can afford to split their resources for longer, keeping themselves in the development race for this year's championship. Anyway, interesting times. I can't wait for the rest of the next 2 days of testing. I'll be keeping a close eye on it, and I'm sure at some point I'll be back. And on that note, if you're interested, I'm thinking of bringing back Monday's live Ask Elvis shows this Monday off the back of pre-season testing. I'd love to know your thoughts. See you soon.